And I'm back with my finished swatch. You can see this is starting to look like a sock. I have about 1 inch of ribbing. Now you don't have to do 1 inch. You could do 2 inches, you could do 1.5 inches, or you could follow Elizabeth Zimmerman's rule of thumb, which is that you knit ribbing until you're sick of it, and then you stop. And then after I knit my inch of ribbing, I've gone and I've knitted 2 inches of stockinette stitch. That's just knitting in the round. So this is a good size for a swatch. I'll have enough space that I can measure my stitches. I'm going to go ahead and show you how to transfer it onto waste yarn so that I can block my swatch and figure out my stitch gauge to make sure that my sock is going to fit well. So I've gone and threaded some yarn on a yarn or tapestry needle. When you're using waste yarn, you want to pick a yarn that's a little bit lighter in weight than the yarn you've knit your project with, because if you use a larger yarn, it's going to stretch out your stitches and it could cause a little ridge once you block it. Now, if you don't have yarn in a lighter weight, you can also use crochet cotton. That works well. You want something smooth that isn't grabby. You could also use unwaxed dental floss. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to slip the needle to the end here, and then the stitch is going to transfer straight across, needle tip to needle tip, onto my yarn needle. And I'm just going to slip these across, one at a time, two at a time, and just keep moving these over. Now you may notice that my work is still attached to my ball of yarn. I'm just going to block this part of the swatch, and if everything works out right, this is going to be my sock. I'll just take this back off the waste yarn, put it back onto my needles, and I'll keep knitting my sock from here. But this way I'll be able to try it on and make sure that I've got enough stretch to it. Okay, one needle off, and I'm going to turn around and come pull the stitches here, turn around and take it off the other needle. All right. Come up here and slip these stitches off as well. Same thing, just straight across. All right, there we go. Everything is moved onto the waste yarn. All my needles are out. I'm going to go ahead and take the ends of my yarn here and tie them in just a little bit of a slip knot that I can undo easily when I want to put them back. I'm going to leave some extra space here so that this sock has room to stretch when I try it on. Just tie a knot here and I'll be able to undo that easily later. All right, now this swatch is ready to block, and if you'll recall, I also have my swatch from the double pointed needles. We'll be blocking that swatch as well, and then we'll be able to measure our gauge and figure out how big a sock to make. Of course, if you don't want to take the time to do that, you just want to knit a sock, and it doesn't matter to you if it fits anyone, you could just leave this sock on your needles and keep knitting. And we'll come back and block, and then you can join us again when we start knitting down to our heel. All right, I'm back to block swatches. First of all, I have our swatch that we knit on double pointed needles. This one's been bound off. It's just for measuring. And then I have a pan of slightly warmer than room temperature water. Now, when you're blocking wool, you don't want to startle your yarn with the temperature. So you don't want your water to be too hot or too cold, because that can make your yarn felt. It'll make it thicken up and it'll make it not very stretchy. So we don't want to change the character of our yarn too much, but we do want to block it because we want to allow the fibers time to relax and to even out a little bit and to tell us how the yarn's going to behave after we wash it. So I'm going to take this swatch, and all I'm going to do is set it in the lukewarm water, and I'm going to gently get the bubbles out, and then I'm going to let it soak in the water for about 20 minutes. And I'm also going to add our hurry up swatch. You'll see it's still attached to my working yarn over here. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set that one in the water too. Get it all the way wet. And then we're going to let these soak for 20 minutes, and then we'll come back and dry them off. All right, I'm back with the swatches for our beginning sock knit along with the twisted skein. We are blocking our swatches today. I've let these soak for a good 20 minutes to help even out my stitches, help the fabric relax, and show me how it's going to behave when washed. You want to be very gentle when taking your swatches out of the water. You don't want to fold them, twist them, or wring them in any way because you can misshape them. Just gently squeezing out a little bit of the water. And I'm going to go ahead and set them over on my towel that I have ready. Take the second one out as well. Again, this one is still attached to my working yarn. Once I've got them set in the towel, I'm going to fold it over, roll it up, and I'm going to blot it to wring out the excess water. This will take it out without distorting my stitches. All right. You can see I'm going to move this over to a dry spot on the towel. You could put it on a separate dry towel if you wanted. And then I'm going to let these lay flat. If I really wanted to, I could pin those edges to keep them straight. You don't want to use stainless steel pins, but I think I'll have enough measurable space without pinning it that I can go ahead and just leave them as they are. I'm going to let these dry. They'll probably be dry tomorrow, and then we'll come back and we'll measure our stitch gauge and figure out how to calculate what size stocks to knit. I'll see you back here then. Now my swatches are both dry. I have here my regular stockinette swatch. I also have my hurry up swatch, or the beginning of the sock, whichever you want to call it. And I'm going to go ahead and set these up to measure my gauge. When you're measuring your gauge, you're measuring how many stitches per inch you're knitting. Now you want to try and measure the largest available area of stitches that are not distorted in your sock. This will give you the best calculation, most accurate calculation of your gauge. So I'm going to go ahead and I want to identify where my stitches are. This is my cast on edge down here. This is my bind off at the top, so I know my stitches are going in V's going this direction. So I can see I've got a column of V's right here. You see the legs come down and meet in a point. So I want the most usable space, and I'm going to work in the center of my swatch so it's not distorted by my bind off or my cast on. And I'm going to insert a tapestry needle threaded with a little bit of waste yarn over and under a couple stitches here, and I'm going to pull the tail up, and I'm just going to go ahead and leave that in my swatch. Okay, that marks the first side. Now I'm going to lay this down flat on my table. I'm going to take my rigid ruler or my stitch gauge, and I'm going to measure hopefully a nice round number. I'm going to pick, I can't quite fit 2.5 inches on here. I'm going to pick 2 inches. If your swatch is a little bigger than mine and you can do 3 inches or 4 inches, so much the better. But you'll get the idea. All right, so I'm going to pick 2 inches. That looks like it's right here. Again, I'm putting a little bit of waste yarn in this ditch between stitches. I can see again I've got the V that comes down right here, so I know I'm going on the side of that V. Pull my waste yarn through, and I'm going to leave that there. All right. Okay, break that off. Now I'm going to take my ruler. We're going to get in nice and close so that you can see my stitches. I'm going to use a needle to count my stitches. Position the 0 over my waste yarn on the left here, and then I'm going to count the centers of my V's across to my other yarn marker. Okay, so I have 1 V, that's 1 stitch, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. I have 11 stitches in 2 inches. And usually you want to do this a couple of times just to make sure it's the same all the way across. And it looks like I've got the same column of stitches at 2 inches all the way down. So if I stay in the same place, those stitches are the same width there, and those stitches are the same width there as well. So If I do the math and I take 11 stitches and I divide it by 2 inches, that gives me 5.5. That means I have 5.5 stitches in every inch. That's going to be my gauge for this sock. And I'll show you how to work that in your numbers in just a minute. All right, now I'm going to come over here and we're going to go ahead and check the gauge on our hurry up swatch. Now, the first thing you can do is you can take this swatch and you can try it on and see if it fits you. If it fits you, then you're in good shape. For socks, the most important measurement is that it fits over the ball of your foot, but also that it stretches and goes up over your heel. So if you have a nice stretchy cast on, this should all come up over your heel and it should fit fine around your ankle. Most hand knitted socks, the common place for them to stop is midway up your calf, but you can make them longer or shorter as you wish. If you make them taller, you may need to have extra stitches at the top and decrease down to your ankle to accommodate for your calf. If you make them shorter, they should still fit fine at the same measurement. Let's go ahead and measure gauge on this swatch. All right, so again, I want to pick a column of stitches that isn't distorted by anything. I'm going to pick this column over here, thread in my waste yarn to mark the beginning. Okay, and then I'm going to want to measure as large a space as I can, straight across. It looks like I can make 2.5 inches on this swatch, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. 2.5 inches puts me right here in this column of stitches. Again, I am checking to make sure that I am coming up next to my V's. Okay, leave that in. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and measure and count the stitches between my markers. So if I'm counting here, I've got 1, again I'm counting the center of the V, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. That's 19 stitches in 2.5 inches. So to find out how many stitches I have in an inch, I'm going to need to go ahead and divide 19 by 2.5. All right, and then I'll come back and show you how to calculate your gauge for your sock. All right, so we've blocked and measured our swatches, we've figured out our stitches per inch, and now we're going to figure out how to calculate the size of sock we want to make. This is going to involve some measuring and a little bit of math, but with a calculator it's not hard. Let me help you figure this out. Okay, so we measured our pink swatch here. This was our heavier weight yarn, and we calculated that there were 11 stitches. So I'm going to come down here. This is my sock measuring guide. You can find a copy of this linked to this video. We're going to come here and it says measure your gauge over 3 or 4 inches. That's ideal. I didn't have 3 or 4 inches, so I did it over 2.5. I've left you a space to put in what you have. All right, so I measured this. Actually, this was over 2 inches. I had 11 stitches in 2 inches. I do my math, and that gives me what I call measurement B, which is 5.5 stitches per inch. Don't round anything yet. We're going to need these numbers. Okay, the other thing that this guide tells us to do is to measure around the ball of your foot at the widest point. So when we size for socks, we always start with the measurement from the ball of the foot. That's our goal measurement. That's where we want the sock to fit best, because you want your sock to be comfortable and not bunch or pull around your foot. So we're going to work with the measurement from that. You want to measure your foot standing up at the widest point. That's usually right behind the toes. I'm going to show you how to do that with my hand rather than try and figure out how to do yoga positions here. So if you're measuring behind the ball of your foot, you'll take your cloth measurement, widest part of your foot. On my hand, it's 7 inches. On my foot, I know it's 8.5 inches. So we're going to go with that measurement. All right, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take measurement A, which is 8.5 inches, and I'm going to multiply it by measurement B. So this is how far around the widest point of my foot is. This is how many in inches. This is how many stitches I get in 1 inch, which is 5.5, and I multiply those together. Now at the beginning of the video I talked about negative ease. That's decreasing the amount of stitches so that your sock stretches a little bit, and that's what helps keep it up and keep it from bunching. So after I multiply these two numbers together, I'm going to multiply by 0.9. That's going to give me 90% of this number, or subtract 10% ease from my sock. So when I do that calculation, I end up getting 42.075. I'm going to forget the 0.75. So this tells me I should cast on 42 stitches for my sock. Now there's something to consider, and that is my ribbing. If I'm doing a 2x2 ribbing, where I knit one, purl one, 42 would be okay. It's divisible by 2, and I'll end up with even pairs of ribbing stitches. But if I'm doing a 2x2 rib at the top of my sock, which is what I'm doing, I want a number that I can divide by 4. 42 is not divisible by 4. So I'm going to round, you can round up or down, I'm going to round up to 44 stitches. This number is now divisible by 4. I'll get 11 pairs of 2x2 rib if I cast on 44 stitches. So this is the number I would cast on for my sock if I were knitting it in this yarn with these needles. All right, and that's a pretty simple calculation. Now, there are a couple other things you want to consider. If you have edema in your ankles, or if you're knitting for someone who does, you may want to measure around their ankles just to make sure they aren't larger than their calf. If you do have ankles larger than your calf, you'll want to measure this, and you may need to increase stitches after your heel. You want to cast on more stitches for your calf, and then decrease those stitches around your ankle or just after your ankle on the foot section to narrow your foot down so that it fits. This is only if you need to do this to make it fit someone who has ankles that are in a different proportion than average. The other calculation that you'll want to check, and I recommend this, is measuring where you want the top of your sock to be. Socks are personal. Everybody likes their socks different heights. Some people like short socks. Some people like tall socks. If you're knitting short socks, you can probably still go ahead and keep the same number of stitches you calculated for your foot. Most people don't change the number of stitches they cast on from the top of the sock down to the foot of the sock. It usually stays the same, but there are exceptions. And as I said earlier, if you're knitting a very tall sock, you will want to measure where you want the top of that sock to fall along your calf, because you may need to have more stitches when you cast on at the top and decrease those stitches as you come down to your ankle to get them closer to the measurement that you calculated for your foot. So say, for example, I measure around the top of my calf and it's 10.5 inches. That's going to be 2 inches bigger than my foot. And so I'm going to want to calculate. I know I have 5.5 stitches in 1 inch. If my sock cuff or top is 2 inches bigger, I'm going to want to cast on maybe 10, maybe 11. Well, I want it to be a multiple of 10. So let's say 8 or 12 more stitches for the top of my sock. And then as I come down the calf right before the ankle, I'm going to want to decrease 2 stitches, I'd say every 4 rows. A total of, if I did 12 stitches, a total of 6 times. If I did 8 stitches, a total of 4 times, to decrease down to the correct size for my foot. I hope that makes sense. We're doing this number just as a double check. If you've knit your swatch, and indeed I knit this swatch with 44 stitches, and you try it on, and it fits where you want it to go, then you should be okay to go. and you shouldn't need to recalculate. You could also, after you've done this calculation, knit a new swatch using this new number and block it and try it on and see if it fits. Or you can now take this number and do the same thing we did with the hurry up swatch, cast it on as the top of the sock, but make sure that you try it on as you come down the ankle to make sure that it is fitting as you go, that it fits over your foot and it fits over your heel. And that's pretty easy to do. You can always put it on waste yarn, or if you're doing 2 circular needles, you can usually slide those to accommodate trying the sock on. And that's a good thing to do. If you're knitting for someone else, you might want to ask them to send you a tracing of their foot and to measure around the ball of their foot for you. That's helpful in calculating the correct size. We'll also be providing you with a chart to help you figure out how to estimate calculations for standard size socks. All right, so as I said, if I measured around the top where I want the top of the sock, and it's, within an inch or so, 1.5 inches of my foot, I don't need to change my number, and I would go ahead and still use the same cast on. Most standard socks, if you look at them, if you just follow the directions and knit your average sock pattern that you would find online, you'll find that usually the foot of the sock and the calf of the sock are the same length. So you're usually measuring a good, I'd say, 7 or 8 inches above your heel. So if you measure from your heel up your calf about 7.5, 8 inches up, it's usually where the top of that sock is going to fall. And that's where you would want to measure. All right, so now that we've figured out what our cast on number is for these pink socks, we're going to go ahead and look at the measurements that we would calculate for our circular needle or yellow swatch. Here's my hurry up swatch. Once again, I can try this swatch on and see if it fits. And if it fits well, I would know that I can go ahead and use this number. I don't need to do any calculation or change anything. I could put this back on my needles, and I'll show you how to do that in a minute, and just keep knitting my sock from here. But if you need to calculate gauge, or if you want to make sure you have the right fit, you can go ahead and calculate that. Okay, so I said I measured the ball of my foot, and that was 8.5 inches. And then I measured my gauge. Again, I didn't have 3 or 4 inches to measure over. I measured over 2.5 inches. And I measured 19 stitches in 2.5 inches. I'm going to go ahead and calculate that. And that's going to give me measurement B, which is 7.6 stitches in 1 inch. I'm going to multiply the number of inches around the ball of my foot. That's 8.5. Measurement A here. Times measurement B, which is the number of stitches I get in 1 inch. Then, in order to calculate a negative ease so that my sock has a little bit of stretch to it and stays up nicely, I'm going to multiply this A times B and then multiply it times 0.9 to give me 90% of the total stitches. The number I get here is 58.14. I'm going to forget the 0.14. I've got a whole number. 58 is divisible by 2. But it is not divisible by 4. And as I said, I'm doing a 2 by 2 rib here, so I want something that's divisible by 4. I would round this number up to 60. And 60 is divisible by 4. I could go ahead and cast on 60 stitches, or if that's what I had here, I could keep knitting. Now, as I said, I cast on 64 stitches, which is fine. 64 stitches fits me well. It's a sock size I'm comfortable with, so I'm going to go ahead and continue with the 64 stitches. It's really close to the number I calculated. I would also want to go ahead. I don't need to change the calculation for my ankle, and these are going to be fairly short socks, so I'm not going to change the calculation for the top of my calf. In fact, I know my calf is like 9.5. Okay, so my number of stitches here times B, this would be close. And I could go ahead and know that this would be close enough that I could continue using this measurement. And besides that, it fits. All right, so the next thing I'm going to show you how to do is how to put these stitches back on your needle and go ahead and continue knitting with them. All right, This is my hurry up swatch. I have this held on waste yarn. I'm going to untie my slip knot here so that I can go ahead and slide this back on my needles. You'll remember this was my front side and I had this on the red needle. So what I'm going to do is I am going to follow the yarn through the stitches and slide this straight back onto my needles. I leave the yarn in right now. I'm just going to slide these stitches straight across, and I'm going to count how many I've put on, and when I've gotten to half of them, I'm going to pull my yarn out and then start with my other needle. Be careful not to split that yarn as you come through the stitches. You don't want to split either the stitch you're going through or this waste yarn that your stitches are on, because that'll make it difficult to remove. Although you can cut it from both sides with scissors and usually work it out, it's easier not to. Okay, that looks like half my stitches. I'm going to go ahead and slide those all the way onto my needle, and then I'm going to come over here and find the middle of my waste yarn, and I'm going to pull that out just on the side with the needle on it. And I'm actually holding it back here so I don't accidentally pull it the wrong direction. Okay, those stitches are all loaded on my first needle, and then I'll turn it around and I'll load them on my second needle. You'll want to be really careful as you're doing this not to stretch your stitches out of shape, because you don't want to have a ridge that runs along your sock where you did this blocking. Split that stitch a little bit, don't want to do that. Almost back. And coax that last stitch up. You can see how I'm using my waste yarn to kind of pull that stitch up so I can find enough space to pick it up. Alright, all those are now on the needle. Okay, now I can pull that yarn out. All my stitches are secure. And now I'm ready to carry on. This is my working yarn. I'm ready to carry on and continue knitting. If you are knitting a standard height sock, as I said, if you take a regular sock and you look at it and you check the measurement, this is the foot, this is the heel, and you fold it in half at the heel, usually you're going to find that your sock is about as long as it is tall. So you'll use about 50% of your yarn for the top part and your heel flap, and the other 50% for the body of your sock. So if you are knitting a regular sock and you don't want, say, a really tall or a really short sock, you're going to do 1 inch to 2 inches of ribbing. You're going to knit the body down, and you're going to knit that at least 4 inches usually. This one, if I check it to the top of my heel flap, is 4 inches from the bottom of the ribbing to the top of the sock. And then once you've knit 4 inches past the ribbing, we're going to go ahead and start the heel flap. All right. If you are doing the careful swatch, then you're going to need to now go and cast on your sock and begin it. So you'll do the cast on, either the regular long tail cast on or the twisted German cast on, and then you're going to go ahead and cast that sock on using either your double point or your 2 circular needles, whichever you prefer. And you're going to begin knitting your sock. You'll also knit the ribbing, and you'll knit down until you're about 4 inches past the ribbing, until your sock is 5 or 6 inches long. And we'll come back and we'll start the heel. Now our next video is going to be how to fix common sock knitting mistakes. I'm going to give you some pointers on how to fix things that can commonly occur when you're knitting socks. And these can be made by any level of knitter. They sometimes say the more experienced the knitter, the bigger the mistakes. But these are things that you can easily fix and spot for yourself. So keep an eye out. If things start looking a little odd with parts of your sock, you can go ahead and put one of those bulb pins around them so that you can find it later, and then we'll look at fixing those mistakes next. All right, happy knitting.